there's all this like hubbub around like, oh, women on low carb diets, it's going to destroy their adrenals and their thyroid, and they're going to become amenorrheic and, all this stuff. But and I don't doubt that happens, but I think that there's a lot of other stuff going on. Primary is inadequate electrolytes, and then also I think they're protein deficient and a bunch of other stuff. But we're an electrochemical battery. Everything in our body is driven by sodium potassium pumps. Every nerve impulse, every thought, every muscle contraction is only a consequence of sodium potassium gradients. And if the sodium potassium ratio in your body is off, things start to go sideways.
Talk a little bit about your journey. What got you so passionate, interested, vested in electrolyte repletion? And I'm presuming it has a lot to do with a lot of the intense training you were doing.
Yeah, it's both humbling. It's a fairly interesting story, but it's also one of important to remain humble and continue to look for people smarter than yourself. But I've been eating a low carb diet for at least 23 years now, and largely settled on that due to, I guess, this, intersection of just poor blood glucose regulation. I'm reasonably lean. I donate blood. I'm not iron overloaded. I lift weights. I do cold exposure. Like, I do everything I can to try to improve insulin sensitivity. And it on my insulin LPIR score, I'm very insulin sensitive. When I do fasting insulin, I'm insulin sensitive on all that stuff. But I just feel like garbage. I can do one reasonably carby meal here and there. But if I do it serially, like if I have breakfast and then lunch and then dinner, like it's by the second or third meal, like I'm just starting to get into this carb roller coaster, and it just is kind of off to the races. So 23 years ago, I figured out that a lower carb diet was good for my blood sugar regulation. And then this interrelated gut autoimmune issue, like I seem to benefit with even reduced fiber intake on that. Like, I'm not 100% carnivore, but it took me forever to figure out that like this giant raw green salad is crushing me. Like, just for me personally, it was a terrible idea. And so there's been all this evolution with things, but I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, have done it for years, and it's a very glycolytic sport, which is kind of at odds with a low carb diet. That glucose glycogen driven, activity that boxing, kickboxing, CrossFit, 800-meter runs, like that's right in that wheelhouse. And that's what I'm not fueling. Low carb diets can top off glycogen, but it takes some time. And although there's some research that suggests over time people will adapt into that, it's just always been a challenge. And I've tinkered with pre-workout carbs and post-workout carbs, and it kind of help. But if I ate enough carbs to really move the needle on my physical performance, then I started feeling like garbage because of the blood sugar dysregulation and everything. And I just kind of, what's the line from C-3PO with Star Wars? It's our lot in life to suffer. I was like, okay, I just suck, and this is just what it is. But I always kept poking around looking for stuff, and something that I would search was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu ketogenic diet, and just see if people were out there doing it. And what was kind of interesting about that is there were people, not a ton, there was a lot of complaining similar to mine. It's like, oh, I feel really good keto, but it's hard to run this on, you run that with jiu-jitsu practice. But I started finding some people that were succeeding. The funny thing is, it was mainly women, which, there's all this like hubbub around like, oh, women on low carb diets, it's going to destroy their adrenals and their thyroid, and they're going to become amenorrheic and all this stuff. But and I don't doubt that happens, but I think that there's a lot of other stuff going on. Primary is inadequate electrolytes, and then also I think they're protein deficient, a bunch of other stuff. But I started running across some folks that were competing at a super high level in jiu-jitsu, were ketogenic, female. And I'm like, well, what the heck are they doing? And almost to a person, they were in this group called Keto Gains. And I started poking around the Keto Gains group. And these two guys that founded Keto Gains, Tyler Cartwright and Luis Villasenor, really sharp guys, very prickly at times too. Like they're very direct with people. And I oftentimes think that I have the bedside manner of a porcupine, but they put me to shame at various points, but they're really smart. And I would argue that they have probably worked with more people, both body recomposition and also high level athletics, doing a low carb or ketogenic diet than possibly anybody in the world. Like there's maybe 3 to 5 people that are similar to them in the volume of people that they've moved through all this stuff. So I started hanging out with them and chatting with them, and became friends with all those folks. And I asked them, I'm like, hey, so I'm struggling with jujitsu and this low carb diet. What do you think I have going on? And they looked at, my protein, carbs, fat, and they're like, I think that you need more electrolytes, specifically sodium. And for ages, I've been in this camp that sodium is not the driver of cardiovascular disease, like on that hypertension side. I think it was 2000, 2001 that I really became aware of insulin resistance causing a change in aldosterone, production, and aldosterone causing this retention of sodium, and that hypertension mainly being a metabolic disease and not I ate too much sodium issue. So I had, for all of my life, all of my career, I've been in this like, oh, sodium's not the problem. It's, you need a lower carb diet, and then, all this stuff will resolve. But so I was not afraid of sodium, but I really wasn't like actively adding sodium to my diet. So like any good person who's written his own New York Times bestselling books and has a science background, I ignored their advice and, went for another year of just struggling and flailing and everything. And then they did something crazy. They said, hey, why don't you weigh and measure all of the food you're eating and all the electrolytes you're consuming, or you think you're consuming, especially sodium. Like, okay, that's very reasonable. And they wanted me at least 5 grams of sodium per day. And when I did all my horse and pony show, I was getting fewer than 2 grams of sodium per day. And which is why I felt like shit all the time. Like, blood sugar was good. Like I had struggled so much with blood sugar for so much of my life that I think I had kind of assigned all of existence to blood sugar control. Okay, I've got my blood sugar control, but there's like going from seated to standing and almost blacking out. There's having that low gear while grinding out a workout and all this stuff. So they looked at where I was at and they're like, are you going to train today? Like, are you doing jujitsu or anything else? I'm like, yeah, I'm doing some jujitsu later. I'm like, okay, do you have any pickle juice? Yes, I have some pickle juice. Okay, get an 8-ounce cup, get about 6 to 7 ounces of pickle juice, do about half of that 20 minutes before you go to jujitsu, and then the last half, like right before you get on the mat. I did it and I was like, turbocharged. I just had energy for miles. It felt like my heart rate at any given work output was like 10 or 15 beats less per minute. I was like, what is going on? And so I went back to them like, hey guys, I think sodium is really important for physical, performance. They're like, yeah, you're an idiot. We know. And so I started really with a fresh set of eyes digging into all this stuff. And I'm like, oh, we're an electrochemical battery. Everything in our body is driven by sodium potassium pumps. Every nerve impulse, every thought, every muscle contraction is only a consequence of sodium potassium gradients. And if the sodium potassium ratio in your body is off, things start to go sideways. There's nothing more tightly regulated in the body than sodium potassium levels, other than maybe pH. Like you could, but it's like we can exist and function with an order of magnitude change in blood glucose levels. But if our electrolytes get off by just a little bit, if our pH gets off by just a little bit, we're dead. we're non-functional first, and then we're dead. And so I was just like, oh my goodness, like this is just, crazy. And then I had been a fan of low carb diets for 23 years. I've written 2 New York Times best-selling books with low carb as a central feature, and not a word about sodium in it, because it just wasn't on my radar. And if one goes to a well-trained dietitian who prescribes ketogenic diets for, say, like epilepsy, that person will make damn sure that the person receiving that prescription will get at least 5 grams of sodium per day as part of their regimen, because these people understand the naturesis of fasting, which is low carb diet or fasting. We drop insulin levels drop, aldosterone and other hormones that cause sodium retention drop, and we just burn through sodium. We dump a lot of water, then we start dumping potassium to try to reestablish the sodium potassium ratio, and this is where people can just go down the drain in like absolute, shocking rapid fashion when they're on a low carb diet and exercising. And I discovered that, wow, even like a small female might need like 10 or 12 grams of sodium per day to be able to function athletically, especially if it's hot, especially if it's humid and high motor output and all this stuff. And so Tyler and Louise just deserve massive props for their understanding of this stuff. They really had this buttoned up, and they had understood it for a long time. And my God, the slings and arrows they took over just trying to get people to drink some pickle juice or try this or try that, it was kind of crazy. But when I had this awakening, I talked to them. I'm like, hey, clearly this is potentially like 99% of the problems that people report on low carb: sleep disturbances, elevated heart rate, HRV changes, thyroid dysregulation, like all of this could arguably be driven by inadequate sodium intake. And they're like, yes. Okay, so how do we get this out to the masses and convince people to fix this? Well, let's do a downloadable PDF that just tells people, eat olives, eat pickles, drink pickle juice, mix up this Gatorade is what we call it initially, which is we would mix it in half-gallon containers, and it was this much sodium, from table salt, some no salt, some magnesium citrate, and then we would do lemon juice and stevia water, shake it up. And we put this up on the interwebs, and within 6 months, we had like 500,000 downloads of it. Like, it was jaw-dropping. And we weren't collecting emails, or was no marketing around it. We just wanted people to know, hey, electrolytes are important, especially if you're on some sort of a low-carb diet. And we just were inundated on social media, like people tagging us. They're like, oh, the Gatorade is amazing. This is so awesome. But I've got to say, it sucks when I'm traveling and I go through TSA and I've got 3 bags of white powder with me. They've got all their stuff with them. And so folks were like, hey, could you do some sort of a convenience thing? And I was like, what, like a scooper or a stick back? And they're like, yeah. So we started looking into it. And the more I looked into it, the better the idea seemed. But when the first flavor we came out with was citrus, and we formulated it such that if it failed as an electrolyte product, we could pivot and sell it as like a margarita drink base. And fortunately, the company has done well, and now we kind of market it as both. But that's where all of this came from. Like, I had no designs on having an electrolyte company or selling people salt or anything, but it was first figuring out what I was doing wrong in this whole thing. And oh man, it's so sad, because I was a decent athlete, even on the low carb thing, but I'm looking back and all these problems I had, like kind of adrenal burnout and different things. It was totally because I didn't have enough sodium. It was, I needed so much more. I could have probably done a little bit more carb cycling and stuff like that too, but the adequate sodium, my sleep is better, my recovery is better. I don't feel totally kind of like sympathetic nervous system blown out. And I had 20, I would say 20 of the 23 years, I was ignorant as to the need for additional sodium. The fortunate thing is this topic seems to have really, we're at a point where this is topically relevant. There are some other smart people in the health and fitness space. There's a bodybuilder, power bodybuilder guy, Sam Efferding, who very much advocates for better sodium intake. James DiNicolantonio, a PharmD who wrote the Salt Fix and whatnot. So there's definitely this kind of watershed moment. The USDA food guidelines, they really it kind of came back around and they're like, sodium isn't quite the horrible thing that we thought it was, but they still said you need to limit the amount of sodium that you eat. But it got a little bit of a reprieve, like a stay of execution in the last go around with stuff. But I mean, that's kind of my long wandering story on this of where this critical need for better electrolyte management, specifically sodium, came from. It was first my issues. And then when I realized where I was failing, I looked at the folks that I'm trying to serve and I was like, oh my God, like 95% of the people I'm working with, like their first five issues that they contend with on kind of lower carb, paleo, keto, carnivore, it's sodium inadequacy, for the most part. And it's kind of cool that we started the company with this freemium thing, with this free downloadable guide, which we still have. Like if people go to drinkelement.com/homebrew, they can still get it. So even if people are like, oh, we think your electrolytes are expensive, it's like, here's the free version. Like go make it yourself, and so it's cool that we clearly identified a massive need in this scene, which I would have never dreamt that there was a hole in the electrolyte world. Like when you think about like Gatorade and Powerade and this and that and the other, I would have never dreamt that there was. But when I sat down to formulate this thing with Tyler and Louise, I really, I was unencumbered with I was not in the sodium is dangerous camp, coming from the paleo background, like Lauren Cordain was very much kind of anti-sodium intake, which I kind of get why, but I think it was also super misguided, particularly within athletic populations. But I just dug into the literature and found things like the American Council of Sports Medicine, their guidelines for athletes in hot, humid environments is 7 to 10 grams of sodium per day. Like 7 to 10 grams, not milligrams, like 7 to 10,000 milligrams of sodium per day, high temperature, high humidity, high motor output. And then and those are in people who are eating, 50 to 60% of their calories from carbs. And so they actually have enough insulin elevation to probably cause some better sodium retention under those circumstances. What does a low carb person need? Well, they might need double that, but again, that's kind of the long meandering story. But I think that we've had the success that we've experienced because we didn't launch with a product first. It was really just, we found a problem. We really tried to fix the problem. And then the people who were fixing the problem told us, hey, this is great. We're solving this, but we would really like a convenient way to deal with this. And then we ended up, creating a stick pack product around addressing that need.
Well, and I'm so glad that you did. And I love the journey of the N of one that expands into, diving down this rabbit hole, helping to dispel a lot of incorrect dogma. As a Western medicine trained nurse practitioner, ER medicine, cardiology, better believe I knew all about electrolyte repletion, which really evolved into my business because I would talk about the fact that yes, if you defecate, if you urinate, if you sweat, if you breathe, you are losing electrolytes just by that virtue. You add in physical activity, humidity. I live in a super humid part of the country, and thinking about my athletic boys, really, really important. Like I now have my 14-year-old on board. My 16-year-old thinks I'm crazy and that he doesn't need electrolytes, but he plays lacrosse and football. And this summer he's going to I was explaining to him, we're going to find a workable solution. We're going to find something that appeals to you and you're going to use it. So when we're talking
just let him get one like calf cramp that nearly shears his tib fib in half. And then it's like, okay, you'll try this now. You know, that'll probably be the quickest thing to solve that.
Well, and it's interesting. I encouraged my 14-year-old. I kept explaining to him about sodium, potassium, magnesium, and chloride. And I said, not to mention other electrolytes. And I kept explaining, I said, if you swim hard for 3 hours, what do you think happens? And so I encouraged him. I said, you've got all these different flavors. Find a flavor that you like. Of course, to antagonize my husband, he picks the one that my husband likes best, but that's a whole separate story.
Right.
And I said to him, tell me how your practice goes when you're well hydrated versus not. And he actually came home and said, I drink 4 of these a day now. So he drinks 4 packets on days he trains. He sleeps better. He has better performance. I mean, he's a butterflyer, so he needs a lot of power to get through those workouts, which are pretty brutal. And for him, he was humbly surprised. And for me, I feel like it's a mom win, because what happens at most sports practices, they have Gatorade, they have Powerade. Right. And maybe the thing to touch on next is, what is it about sugar and the oral rehydration therapies that are kind of conventionally available? What actually happens? Because we know that sugar can actually facilitate the uptake of sodium. So I understand that piece, why it's probably added. But I think for a lot of people, they don't recognize that the high fructose corn syrup and artificial colors and all these other components of these, pre-made oral rehydration therapies, or maybe I'll put it in air quote as a therapy, because it may not actually be particularly helpful when you look at the macros, how this can be beneficial or non-beneficial, and how your product, which I fervently stand behind and love, how your product is very different than, should I even say that Gatorade? I can say Gatorade. It's my podcast. The more conventional options that are out there.
Yeah. So here's an interesting aside. We had a good friend who went to the Gatorade museum, University of Florida and everything. I think their daughter was starting school there, and they're like, oh, we'll go by the Gatorade museum. And they had one of the first containers of Gatorade ever that hit commercial production, and it had 1 gram of sodium per serving, just like LMNT does. And it had the sugar also, but in the beginning, in the Paleolithic of oral rehydration products, Gatorade was pretty damn good. And when you think about for the time, it was very well thought out. And right prior to Gatorade itself, the thought around hydration was generally chew on salt tablets and then sip water per your thirst. And we never had people who like at military boot camps and football double days and whatnot, we shifted into this thing where people should drink 8-ounce glasses of water a day and pee clear and all this type of stuff. And we started having people get sick and die from hyponatremia, from so diluting their sodium. And you're an ER practitioner, and so you know how dire that situation is. That never happened. Like 1940s, 1950s, like they would tell people to chew on salt tablets and then sip on water up to their thirst satiety mechanisms. And that is so much better informed than where we are really now. So I know the question was specifically around like kind of the glucose and all that, but we went from salt tablets, drink to satiety, then Gatorade was kind of this game changer where they had a significant amount of sodium, they had some glucose. Glucose does facilitate the uptake of sodium, but you could almost look at it the opposite way. So these transporters, the SGLT transporters, are sodium glucose transporters. You could almost make the case that the sodium facilitates the uptake of glucose, not the other way around. And really that's, at the end of the day, the way mechanistically, like the biophysics, this is actually the way that this stuff works. And in a situation like cholera or something where somebody's going to die because they're just blowing through both body water and electrolytes, and if somebody's vomiting, like potentially blowing off massive amounts of acid so that they're becoming alkalotic and whatnot, that can be a lifesaver, and you need something where you can stomp on the gas pedal with it and really get this rapid response. But there's a couple of different problems with that. One is that there's a claim that you can't absorb electrolytes without glucose, which is patently true, or untrue. We can actively transport that stuff in. It costs us a little bit of energy to do that. We can use amino acids, charged amino acids, in the same way that the glucose can actively transport that stuff. We can use ketone bodies or butyrate. So like if you're eating some fiber or you're in a ketogenic state, those things can help absorb that. And so there's a couple of different mechanisms whereby we can bring these items into the body. A piece of the story is that I think by and large, people are just consuming too much sugar, particularly when we look at youth sports. Like we've got these 6-year-old kids that are playing soccer and they're barely doing much of anything. Like they spin their arms and do a little bit of warm up, and then they chase a ball that's nearly as tall as them and they do 20 minutes of it. And it's like, okay, kids, here's some cupcakes, here's some cookies, and then here's a big bottle of Gatorade. And it's like, they maybe burned 15 grams of glucose during that whole thing, and now we're sticking 100 grams of glucose back into their body to, like, you know, top them off. So that's kind of a problem. And then the reason, really specifically, the reason why we didn't use glucose for LMNT is that, are you a large male, a small female? Are you doing a super hard physical activity? Or are you doing like a zone 2 cardio session where you're only trying to mobilize fat? And so most of the products I mean, all of the products effectively exist. They just have like this kind of one size fits all glucose dose. And what I find is that it fits almost nobody's needs perfectly, and it imperfectly matches 99% of you know folks' needs. So what we recommend to people is, so an example for myself, like I might have a container. This is a larger container. I might do 2 stick packs of LMNT in this, and I'll take that to jujitsu with me, and I'll just sip on maybe half of this, which would be about a half a liter through my technique portion, which is a little demanding, but it's not super demanding. Then when we get ready to do open rolling, basically sparring with each other, really, really hard grappling, I'll look around the room, and if it's a bunch of beat up old has-beens like me, I may not even add any glucose to the mix. But if it's a bunch of like 20-year-old no-necked wrestlers, I will take glucose tablets and throw those down. So I don't even add glucose to my drink because I want to control how much glucose I get separate from my electrolytes. If I throw the glucose in here, then I'm stuck with whatever is in there. So I actually dose the glucose separate from my electrolytes so I can really control that stuff. And not everybody needs to do that. Not everybody does do that. But what I find is folks' needs for electrolytes are more consistent than their needs for glucose happen to be. So I kind of toggle the glucose switch separate from the electrolyte switch. And then that way people can really fine tune this stuff. And again, if we just had this one size fits all product, like there are a lot of people that like doing intermittent fasting, and they'll do some sauna. And if you do intermittent fasting and sauna and you're not doing electrolyte repletion, then you're just like, you're writing yourself a prescription for, I desperately want head trauma. You know, like Peter Attia posted where he was fasting and he did a sauna and like he split his head open, and he's like this decorated surgeon and physician and one of the smartest people on the planet. And I pinged him a text. I'm like, Peter, really? Like you're fasted, low carb, and you're in a sauna, and you didn't think you might fucking pass out? And he's like, yeah, I know, it's kind of an idiot. But so, you know, in this way, when we separate the glucose from the electrolytes, then people can really easily customize all that stuff. So again, I know that was a super long, rambly answer, but that's kind of the background on all that stuff. And there are absolutely reasons to add glucose or other things to facilitate that oral rehydration therapy. But, funny enough, Liquid IV, which is one of the more, the other popular brands, they're coming out with a sugar-free version, even though they've hung their whole business on like, you don't absorb electrolytes without glucose. That's a lie. And we've been mentioning it. That is not true. There may absolutely be reasons why you want glucose, but we've been arguing to maybe decouple those two things and be able to toggle them separately. So their next product that they're coming out with is a sugar-free version, which I think is kind of validating of what we've been up to for a long time.
Well, and I think it's really interesting how personalized, for everyone that's listening. Obviously, I use electrolytes all day long. I'm a huge proponent of them. I'll share something personal. I had surgery a couple of weeks ago, orthopedic surgery. And I knew that my, all the things I track, my Oura ring, my HRV, all these things, I knew these metrics would be off. I took my CGM off because I knew for the first week after surgery, I was sleeping well. What's been interesting, and I was saying to my husband, is that my HRV has been so off, even though my metrics for deep and REM sleep are actually not all that bad. I'm getting plenty of sleep. And I actually said to my husband the other night, I wonder if I need more salt. And so I started, I was doing my LMNT. I was using a product that I have. I was adding Quinton ampules. So I was increasing, the sodium, and I found 3 ampules of Quinton on top of my normal dose. Then my HRV came back down. Then my deep sleep started to increase. And so that personalization, like, this is where I think these metrics of having biotracking devices is really helpful. I just find that having a CGM or even a glucometer, and I know you're a proponent of those, and then having an Oura allows me to really fine tune what I need, to the point sometimes that I was like, I have to back off because you can get obsessive. But I think it also speaks to what you were saying, that there are times when you need that glucose when you're grappling with these young gentlemen. But if you're, with, a group of your peers, you feel like you can just drink your element and that, meets your needs. So let's talk a little bit about what are some of the common ways that people will lose electrolytes other than just exercise, because I really lean back on my cardiology background. And I think about one disorder in particular, POTS or dysautonomia, which it was such a problem when we had patients that came in and got diagnosis. We would refer them to the POTS experts because we were essentially left to just give them drugs that would keep their blood pressure up, because one of the things they dealt with was a significant degree of orthostasis and orthostatic hypotension, which means when they would go from a seated or standing position, they would have significant fluctuations in their blood pressure. But what are some of the other things? I think about medications. I think about, POTS or dysautonomia, which is unfortunately becoming much more common. Think about breastfeeding women. What are some of the other things that you have found that electrolytes have been super helpful for?
Man, just as like a broad background, I'm glad that you mentioned the HRV, and I too get a little almost prickly about devices, because I kind of feel like there's about a 2 or 3 month period of insight that we get from something like an Oura ring, and Oura people are going to hate me now, but I feel like it kind of hits a brick wall at some point. Like I was finding that I would go to bed and I'd read a book and I had my blue blockers on and I'd fall asleep and everything, but the Oura ring would ding me and it would say that I had sleep latency issues. And, because it was interpreting my reading as this inability to fall asleep. So then I would take the ring off until I was done reading the book. And then I'd put it on, and then I would get my good sleep score, and I'm like, oh, screw this, I'm over it. But because you start doing all kinds of weird stuff just for like the carrot of a better score. But all that said, man, it's been such an eye opener how dramatically improved HRV is when people are on point with electrolytes, and it's this thing that just happens immediately. A cool element of fixing electrolyte status is if you're feeling kind of off, if you're just feeling, for so long, I can't tell you how many afternoon espressos I drank, and what I needed was to eat a pickle. I needed to eat a pickle, drink pickle juice, or eat 15 olives. Like I didn't need an espresso boost. I needed some sodium. It was really the big deal. But so the things that definitely affect it, heat and humidity are huge factors, and just ambiently being in a warmer environment really changes things. We spent 2 years living in Texas. And now we live in Montana, and my electrolyte consumption dropped by like a third, just out of the gate, just arriving here, because it's much cooler, it's much less humid, I don't sweat as much, and I'm still doing jiu-jitsu, I'm still working out, but it was just survival in Texas. Like you go outside and get hit with like that wall of southern
like
humidity, and you're like, yeah, it's just like an oven, and it never really ends. So that's a big deal. But ironically, also cold and elevation are really big factors that can sneak up on people. When it's cold, we tend to get a dysregulation in our thirst mechanism. So we tend to not be as thirsty. And I think that that's probably because our body doesn't want us to consume liquids, which are themselves cold. And so there's kind of a feed forward mechanism there, but both cold weather and elevation can dramatically increase our electrolyte needs. Exercise can double or triple, or, like if I need 4 to 5 grams of sodium, if I'm relatively sedentary, say like I'm writing a bunch of papers and stuff like that. If I'm active and it's a little warm and I'm doing some jujitsu, so I'm wearing a gi, I may need 10 or 12 grams of sodium. So I've got a doubling, nearly a tripling of sodium need. Kind of controversial, but there are some good papers that support this. But both the severe elements of COVID and long COVID, you see chronically decreased sodium levels in people. And just very anecdotally, we've had folks, and again, it doesn't have to be element. There's nothing magical about that other than it tastes good and it's convenient. But if we just get people to address sodium needs, like I feel way better, like a bunch of that long COVID issue goes away. Even in the acute phase where people are like maybe teetering on the brink of, things getting more severe, adequate sodium intake seemed to be a real game changer for people. So those are definitely big ones. Really early on, we started getting tagged by the folks in the POTS community because one person did element and they're very aware of the need for higher sodium intake. It's kind of hard to find a product, like all of them have sugar and none of them really have adequate levels of sodium and whatnot. And so we started getting tagged on this stuff. And then we did a whole month last year of POTS awareness. And so we've had a really awesome, synergistic relationship there. And then another one is breastfeeding, ironically, and not so breastfeeding in general, but also within this like pumping, exclusive pumping kind of communities, like everybody gets kind of fractionated into their different camps, but for a variety of reasons, there are moms that want to make sure that their kids get the breast milk, but either they have latching issues or work, whatever. But the exclusively pumping moms are in this like pressure cooker because they have to perform. Like there's all this stress, all this scrutiny and everything. And like my wife, she exclusively pumped on our oldest daughter for 13 months and before we started, incorporating some other stuff. Like she was just at her wit's end by then. And the electrolyte story was not on our radar at all, but we started getting it tagged again on social media where these exclusively breast pumping moms would show the little clear, volumetric cylinders. And it's like, yesterday I pumped this much and it was like just a paltry little amount. And it's like, I took this and they would show a picture of an element stick. It's like, I took 2 of these and then they would have like 6 full bottles of breast milk the next day. And I was like, wow, okay. And then I dug into the physiology of breast milk production, and it's not just fluid volume. If you just drink water, it doesn't necessarily mean that you increase breast milk production because it's an osmotic gradient. You need sodium as a driver of that osmotic gradient to pull the casein, the proteins, the lipids, the whole ball of wax is driven in an osmotic gradient that it is driven by sodium. And then you look at cortisol release, which is antagonized by sodium intake. We tend to suppress cortisol release with adequate sodium. And cortisol is one of these major antagonists of breast milk production. improving sleep enhances. So there was like 5 or 6 different mechanisms where I was like, oh, this makes sense that, adequate electrolytes are really going to benefit there. So the breastfeeding mom is a biggie. The POTS, athletic activities, heat, humidity, elevation, different temperature scenarios. Those are all really big situations where we see increased electrolyte need for sure.
Well, it's really interesting because I was one of those moms. I worked part-time as an NP, but I rounded in the hospital. And so I would, more often than not, I would pump when I could have eaten. And so I remember, if you were a mom who breastfed and worked and had to pump in between all the things, I always remember that days I rounded in the hospital, I could never get the same volume of breast milk production on the days I was off, because on the days I was off, I could drink water or whatever I was drinking, and I could urinate at will. And when you're in the hospital, you want to be a camel. You don't want to have to go to the bathroom, especially when you're rounding on patients. So that makes complete sense. I think that's really interesting. One thing that I wanted to kind of touch on is, when we're talking about electrolytes, we've talked a little bit about sodium, and I think people recognize these names, but are at least kind of cohesively talking about what are some of the major roles of like magnesium, because magnesium is the one that in cardiology, everyone always thought about potassium, but never magnesium. And especially with my electrophysiology background, all the arrhythmia patients I took care of, I used to always say, has anyone checked a magnesium? And it can't just be any old magnesium. It needs to be serum, RBC mag, because then we could properly replete, and that oftentimes would fix just about any problem we were experiencing. So for the benefits of listeners who may not be as familiarized with what some of these particular electrolytes do in the body, kind of highbrow, just because I think it's important. They hear me harp about magnesium, not as much about potassium, but certainly about sodium.
Yeah, so broadly, we have, I guess, the main electrolytes that are going to be active in the human body: sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium in kind of the positive charged metal ion world. And in the anion world, we have chloride, phosphates, and then bicarbonates would I guess kind of technically plug into that. I'm probably forgetting one or two somewhere in there, but those are the biggies, and they cover most of what we have going on. Calcium is a player in this, but it's a player in muscle contraction, but it's kind of secondary or tertiary, and the dynamic flux happens on a much slower timeline. So it's again the thing that really changes most dynamically, I would argue, is probably sodium, is probably the biggest dynamic element, and then potassium secondary to that, and then magnesium tertiary to that. Sodium and potassium end up getting partitioned in our cells and extracellular fluid spaces in such a way that it's almost like water behind a dam. And if you think about water behind a dam, when we open up a gate and we've got a turbine, as the water goes through, that potential energy, the gradient of high water here going to low water there, there's the ability to attach that to doing work. We do similar things with gradients of ions in our body. So we'll have a lot relatively of sodium outside of cells, a lot relatively of potassium inside cells. And when those two equilibrate, we're able to attach energy production out of that. And everything we do, all the ATP synthesis, nerve contractions, like everything is driven by that. So those are also why, if we get a little bit off on sodium or potassium levels, we start feeling like garbage rather quickly, because fine motor skills, eyesight acuity, hearing, all those things start going sideways pretty quickly. I had not really thought about this, but even scenarios like when we start having hearing difficulty and vision loss at very altered sodium potassium levels, it's literally because the nerves aren't functioning properly anymore, so it's not just fine motor skills and whatnot, it's actually like other sensory input. And then we have magnesium, which plays so many different roles in the body, and it is technically an electrolyte, but it ends up being involved in ATP synthesis. It plays a role of kind of catalyzing the conversion of ATP into energy. It's involved again in muscle contraction, relaxation, and it's kind of more synergistic with calcium in that regard. What's kind of interesting to me in this whole big story is we definitely want adequate levels of magnesium. We tend not to get them. We want adequate levels of potassium. We tend not to get them. Most people overconsume sodium relative to potassium and magnesium, but it's because they eat a ton of processed food. Whenever somebody shifts from a processed food diet to a minimally processed diet, they automatically increase their potassium, magnesium, and decrease their sodium, which ironically also tends to increase their sodium needs in that whole story. But if we get adequate sodium, our kidneys do a pretty good job of, okay, we'll keep this much potassium, get rid of that much, we'll keep this much magnesium, get rid of that much. But if we are underpowered in our sodium intake, it's actually difficult for the kidneys to sort all of that out and keep us at a stable state. So I do kind of put the sodium intake as kind of primary in this story, because if we get that appropriate, then everything else has a tendency to sort itself out rather well. But if we are inadequate in sodium, the kidneys are kind of stuck with, okay, well, do I jettison a bunch of potassium to try to re-equilibrate the sodium potassium ratio? Do I jettison a bunch of potassium and magnesium to try to re-equilibrate these things? So ideally, we eat a minimally processed whole food diet that we supplement adequate sodium. And by supplement, I mean salt shaker, eating salty foods like sardines and olives and anchovies and all that type of stuff. And then things really click. Like we're kind of getting into a slipstream there where our physiology is working really well, and we're doing it in a way that's pretty easy to implement on like a lifestyle front.
Well, I think it's just important for people to understand that there is more to electrolytes than I think a lot of the women that I work with think about electrolytes purely from the perspective of, I know when I take certain forms of magnesium, it helps me sleep. I know when I take certain forms of magnesium, it helps me go to the bathroom. And that's one of the reasons why I definitely wanted to connect with you, so that we could provide a broader context. Now, one thing you kind of alluded to towards the beginning of our conversation was this kind of overtraining syndrome, over fasting, over, restricting macros. And I would imagine in your community, and probably over the past 23 years, you've seen this happen both in men and women. And so where do you think that stems from? Because I'm starting to see some of this because of the environment that I'm in, and working with a lot of women, that if a little bit of hormesis is good, more has to be better, is kind of the methodology they'll go through, like restrict more carbs, eat less food, over fast. What are some of the ways that you, when you're working with people or you're lecturing on these topics, you try to kind of bolster greater awareness of some of the strategies that we're going a little bit overboard, we're overtraining, we're, over restricting in a way that's not beneficial? I always say that a little bit of hormesis is good, too much is not good.
Yeah. I did my first article that was published on intermittent fasting in 2005, and it went out mainly to a CrossFit related scene, CrossFit related community. By 2006, I desperately regretted releasing this thing because these CrossFitters, God bless them, but like they're, yes, from like an ancestral health perspective, we are an active species. Yes, we should be out doing things and moving. But if somebody is doing CrossFit on anything like a kind of consistent basis, your allostatic load, like your total stress load, you are right at the max. Like you have stomped the accelerator through the bottom of the car, and you're just hammering. And that's okay. Like if you're really into CrossFit or whatever, that's fine. but then people will see things like, oh, I did keto and I lost 100 pounds. And they're like, well, shoot, I just want to lose 5 pounds. So clearly losing 5 pounds is easy compared to 100, which isn't necessarily true, as you and I both know. Like, once you get lean, it may actually be harder to lose that last spot. But I'll go keto. Oh, and this intermittent fasting thing is great. And I need autophagy, because if we have autophagy, then I won't get cancer and I'll never get neurodegenerative disease. And so you end up with folks who do CrossFit twice a day, 6 days a week. On their day off, they do hot yoga with a 20-mile ruck march with a 40-pound vest, and they eat 5 grams of carbs a month. They intermittent fast 22 hours a day. And they're like, I don't know what happened, but my hair all fell out and I haven't had a libido in 18 months and my performance has been completely retrograde. And it's like, well, you took all of these different things, all of them that can be good at one level, and you just layered them on top, and they're not additive, they're multiplicative, and right at the beginning of COVID, I did a talk that unfortunately didn't get the circulation I would have hoped it would, but it's called Longevity, or Are We Trying Too Hard? And it just, you can link to it if you want. It's one of the talks I'm the most proud of, because fasting and whatnot, I am as big a fan of fasting and ketogenic diets and whatnot as anybody in the world. But, so this thing will come up around LMNT. People will say, does LMNT break a fast? And I'm like, well, what are you doing? Well, I'm fasting for autophagy. And I'm like, well, you get autophagy drinking coffee, you get autophagy lifting weights, you get autophagy going out and getting a tan. You'll get enhanced autophagy doing a fasting mimicking diet, which is only, doing 500 to 700 calories a day. So doing this thing that is sugar and calorie free is absolutely not going to break your fast. And does that even matter in the big scheme of things? And is all of this work with autophagy really, at the end of the day, all that good for you? Because we have things like the Hayflick limit and the number of cell replication cycles we could have. And just jamming the accelerate on autophagy means that we may be burning through all of our stem cells, like something that nobody in this like pro autophagy scene talks about is that animals that are really aggressively fasted die extremely young, and they die from total systemic organ failure that happens all at once because they ran out of stem cells. And I haven't seen one goddamn person like talking about this stuff, and so you have people that are really conscientiously trying to do things to better themselves and to be in a good situation, to age well and whatnot. And I think they've just kind of lost their minds. Like, do some exercising, do, maybe once a month, do that 48-hour fast if you want to. But what my perspective, once people are lean and pretty metabolically healthy, if your question is, should I fast an extra day a week, or should you add an extra day a week of resistance training? Lift the weights, get the tan, go do the meditation retreat, like go join a poker group or something, so you've got better interactions, and better human contact. Like, this work around fasting is, so, in my opinion, so speculative, because what all of it compares is sick animals overfed in a lab environment versus animals underfed in a lab environment. It is not comparing a phenotypic, super healthy, super athletic individual with the fasting. So the question shouldn't be, will fasting improve your life versus overeating and being sedentary? Yeah, absolutely. Like, if you eat less of terrible food, then it's probably going to be a benefit. The real question in my mind, the comparison needs to be, are you eating a species appropriate diet, going to sleeping and living in a species appropriate way, doing some cardio, doing some strength training? That is our control group. Now let's compare that to the intermittent fasting group and tell me that that is going to like double the lifespan of that group, I think it's garbage. I think that you're going to see things go completely the opposite direction. So I think like fasting, intermittent fasting can be an amazing adjunctive tool for just basic calorie restriction. Like such a powerful tool. Some people, that is like the thing that they finally get control of their calorie intake, and they find that it's easier to do that. But man, when you've got people that are burning the candle at both ends and running and gunning real hard with their physical activity, and then they throw carb restriction, calorie restriction, timing restriction on top of all that stuff too, I think that they're really asking for a lot of problems. And I think that the long term, we're gonna see not awesome consequences come out of all that stuff.
Well, I think you bring up some really good points, because what it ultimately comes down to is we have to have some degree of balance. I always say balance is elusive, but when you're going to extremes, whether it's dietary extremes, exercise extremes, fasting extremes, that's, this overload of these stressors on the body, which we know can weaken us. They're not contributing to making us stronger as individuals. Now, you alluded to some of the things that you think are especially important in terms of, species specific nutrition, species specific strength training. What are some of the other things that you think are really important? Are you a fan of zone 2 cardio? Is that something that you talk much about? I know the answer is yes, but maybe for the benefit of listeners, explaining what makes zone 2 cardio actually unique and purposeful.
Yeah, and here's a thing. I do think it's super important, and it's something that I had underappreciated for a good chunk of my career. What's interesting to me is just stomping around the world. It's kind of hard to stay specifically in that zone 2 level. If you're hiking, like it's very challenging. Like if there's much of an uphill gradient, you're going too hard. If it's flat or a downhill thing, then your heart rate isn't actually high enough. And so it's actually, this is something that I'm intrigued about. It's like, if it's so damn important and we get so much benefit from it, it's like, what the hell were we doing that we could stay consistently in there? Or maybe there's a little bit more to the story that we could be kind of intermittently in and out of that. But it really enhances mitochondrial biogenesis, because we tend to be primarily burning fat is the preferred fuel source in that scenario. Some very smart athletes, like the famous Kenyan runners, will do. So I was just beating up on fasting. Now here's an example where I'll sing its praises. These folks will do fasted zone 2 cardio, but their diet overall is about 70% carbohydrate. So a high carbohydrate diet to accommodate the high intensity activity that they do. But they will do a morning for them, relatively low intensity. Like I would die trying to run as fast as they do at zone 2. Like I would literally keel over and die almost immediately. But that training is almost, it's basically a fat adapted training block that they do, because they're fasted, so their liver glycogen is comparatively low, and the intensity is low enough that they're primarily using fat as a fuel source. And so you get mitochondrial biogenesis, you get angiogenesis, so you get the growth of blood vessels, you get that in the heart, in the lungs, in the muscles, in the brain. We get BDNF release, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is huge for brain health, memory, neurological health. And just as an aside with that too, for BDNF to be functional in our brain, we have to have ketone bodies present for it to function. And it doesn't mean that you have to be specifically on a ketogenic diet, but you can't be so metabolically broken that you're incapable of producing ketone bodies, in which case you don't get that effect. So stress relief, the literature on strength training and longevity is not nearly as good or as compelling as cardio and longevity. Like cardio really does seem to confer some legit longevity benefits, but I would say also that cardio has been kind of more the darling of exercise physiologists, and a little easier to quantify and look at. I do think that a modicum of strength training just really enhances the quality of life that people can have. Primary determinant of staying out of a rest home is just being able to go from seated to standing, and have the strength to and power to prevent yourself from tripping and falling, or if you do trip and fall, to not suffer a catastrophic injury like a hip fracture, or major fracture. So I do think that that's important. But the zone 2 stuff is fascinating to me, and it's accessible in that it's pretty pleasant. Like if you can just get people doing it, they can watch a TV show while they're walking on the treadmill, or listen to a podcast. You can do it indoors, although I think doing it outdoors and getting light on your person and everything is all really valuable. But people will immediately feel better. They're not super sore from doing it. They tend to have a bump their cognition and their affect and everything. So it seems to lend itself well to people habituating to it and continuing to do it.
I have to agree. It's funny. My integrative medicine doc is always on my case about zone 2 training. And so I figured out exactly how fast I have to walk. If it's raining, I walk on my treadmill, but otherwise I'm outside. I know exactly how fast I have to walk, at what pace, to get in that sweet spot where I'm not like over pushing myself, but I'm not taking a leisurely walk. And so I can usually get that in.
Right.
One thing that I think is important, and this will be our last kind of topic, is when we're talking about strength training, I think because of where I am life stage wise, I think a lot about sarcopenia. I think a lot about where insulin resistance actually starts in our muscles. And so when I'm talking to individuals, and especially on the podcast, I always like to have this reiteration of how critically important strength training is. Like for people out there, whether they're women that are doing chronic cardio, or they're people that are just overtraining, like really understanding that muscles are super important in terms of longevity. You mentioned being in the hospital or being in a position where you can go from getting off the commode or getting out of bed. How many 50-year-olds I saw over the years when I was doing rounds who couldn't get out of bed by themselves because their muscles had atrophied so much in their legs that they had lost the ability or the strength to be able to do that. And so just want to kind of dovetail this last comment is, in your estimation, what is the minimum amount of strength training that you like to see, or do you advocate for, to be able to maintain and continue to build muscle as opposed to lose it? Because I think for a lot of women, when they get into middle age and they're getting closer to menopause, the hormones, our sex hormones are kind of working against us unless it's being replaced. And so, that and the loss of some insulin sensitivity can make it a little bit more challenging, but certainly something I think everyone needs to be working towards.
Man, it seems like at least 2 days per week is kind of a program minimum. I mean, if folks can only fit in 1 day a week, this is almost a more is better thing, but I'm not also saying that people need to spend 2 hours a day, 6 days a week in the gym. A real inspiration of mine is this guy, Arthur Devaney. He's a retired economics professor and just a hell of a physical specimen. And he's been in and around this ancestral health scene since before the 90s. Like he had a kind of a manifesto that he wrote called Evolutionary Fitness back in the mid 90s. And that's when I first found him and have followed his work ever since then. And he would do these really brief but fairly intense workouts where say like the lat pull down machine, he would go over to the lat pull down machine and he would put a light weight on there and do it slow and controlled for about 15 reps. Just get a little bit of heat, a little bit of burning going. And then he would pop the weight up and he would do it a little bit faster for about 8 reps, a little bit more explosive. And then he's getting a sense of kind of where he's at. He's kind of warmed up. And then he'll put a pretty heavy load on there for him. And he might get like 4 to 6 reps. And the last one is like, that was it, like he's done. And then he might back it off a little bit and do one more set of maybe like 6 or 10 reps, really get a little bit of lactic acid going, get a little bit of a burn. And then he's done on that. And then he might do exactly the same thing with a press, maybe a vertical. So we've got vertical pull, vertical press, horizontal pull, push, horizontal press. And then with our legs, we've got lunging, squatting, and kind of hinging or deadlifting. So he would do a vertical pull and then a vertical press, and then he would do a leg movement, and then he was out. And he would do that same thing, about 15 reps slow, 15, 20 reps, and then about 8 to 10 reps kind of heavy, and then maybe between 3 and 5 reps, like really kind of getting after it. And then he was done with that movement. That whole thing, he would do a little bit of balance to warm up and some mobility work and everything, but his whole workout was less than 15 minutes.
Wow.
And it would leave his heart elevated. And I mean, he at 68 years old, 70 years old, he's in his mid 80s now, and he's still just a hell of a physical specimen. But I remember the stats on him when he was in his early 70s, 6'2", 210 pounds, 8% body fat, and just jacked. And this was his workout. And every once in a while he would do a little bit of heavier stuff, but it was never like an hour. It was just super abbreviated workouts, you know, and that's all you need. Like the people need to train a muscle about to failure, like where you can't really get another rep, and it's pretty hard, and you need to hit that maybe once a week in the primary lifts and everything, and then to be generally physically active beyond that. So what we're talking about there, and I know that it can take time to get to the gym and get home from the gym, and so like your 15 or 20-minute workout, and then there's maybe some warm up on and cool down on the backside of that. So your 15-minute workout really ends up maybe being an hour and a half, because you got to go to the gym, come home, and all that. That's why I think people should park their cars outside and have a home gym. And even if it's something where you and your neighbors get together and you buy, what's a cheap gym membership is maybe like $50 a month. What if you and your neighbor pool 6 months worth of $50 a month? You know, you get $1,000 and you buy $1,000 worth of like dumbbells and some exercise bands and a pull-up bar or something. You just work out at home. Then you don't even have to travel or whatever, you know. But I think 2, maybe 3 days a week of like a full body, you know, and again, like horizontal pull, horizontal press, and then some sort of squatting, leg pressing, lunging, deadlifting type movement. And if you don't know how to do those, there's innumerable how-to videos online. You can get coaching that ranges from super inexpensive to ridiculously expensive, you know, either live or virtual. There are people all around the world that will just shoot video of you, and you can put it on like your FaceTime or a Zoom, like what we're doing. And they can say, no, butt back, chest forward, you know, and you can get outstanding remote coaching. So I think 2 or 3 days a week, kind of a minimum is, and God, the return on investment with that is just staggering. So here's kind of a cool stat. A strength trained 90-year-old can have better physical capacity than a sedentary 50-year-old. Like that's like, it's literally getting double your life. So everybody's all focused on like, oh, I'm going to live to be 150 years and old and double my lifetime and all that stuff. I don't think any of that's going to happen anytime soon. They might crack some code somewhere. I don't think intermittent fasting is going to do that. I don't think any of the stuff that we have before us is going to do that. But you know what will effectively double your life is having a zone 2 cardio base and 2 or 3 days a week of strength training with a little bit of mobility work, because you will go into old age an absolute ass kicker. Like you won't be crippled by a fall. If you get a pulmonary virus, you've got when your immune system ramps itself up, where it gets protein from to build antibodies is from our muscle mass. And so when you've got that muscle mass repository, that is where your immune system pulls all this stuff together, to say nothing of your better cardiovascular fitness, and you have better circulation, and your immune system is better tuned, and you have, you know, all the right things are happening. So it is such a nominal investment. And again, like, if you like being in the gym, go for it. Like go hang out in the gym a bunch. Like that's awesome. But if you don't really like it, like I'll oftentimes hear people say, well, I do yoga or I do gardening and that's my thing. And I'm like, I get it. And that's great. And it's awesome. But the thing is that our body gets really good at adapting to what we're doing. And if we were to graph physical decline, once your body gets used to that yoga program, unless you are really craftily figuring out ways of additionally loading your body is declining. It has adapted to that. Now it's declining. This is the amazing thing of progressive physical overload that can be afforded by barbells and dumbbells and machines, is that we can keep pushing that. And again, the sedentary curve of decline is very, very rapid. Whereas if we're strength training, our health span and our lifespan end up matching up together, and it goes out, and then we've got like 2 weeks where we usually get sick and we die, and that's it. And I'm not excited about that, but it sounds a lot better than like a 30-year decline. And also, again, I was just listening to a Huberman Lab podcast, and they were talking about adequate strength training and a little bit of zone 2 cardio if you are genetically prone to cognitive decline. And again, this is not even factoring in diet. So diet wasn't remotely a factor in this, which I think can play a massive role in cognitive decline, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia, and all that. But just simply being physically active, the most active people had it forestalled the development, the beginning of dementia type symptoms by more than 10 years. Like, it didn't even start to happen until 10 years later. And the rate of acceleration was much, much flatter. And again, that's just looking at exercise. So these may be exercisers who still eat maybe not as good as what we would like. If they were eating the way that you and I have recommended that folks eat, then maybe we get a totally different thing out of that. But like, gosh, you're less likely to lose your marbles. You've got better quality of life. Your sex life is going to be better. Your outlook is better. And the cost is that you've just got to get going and habituate and do it and find something that you like. And again, like, I love gardening. I love yoga. I think all those things are good, but man, a little bit of progressive overload that you can get out of a gym type setting, you can't beat that. It's just magic for what it can do for people. And this is, it's pretty simple. When people do physical therapy, even when they're at very low capacity, they're progressively overloading that stuff. It looks more like a bodybuilding gym session than it does a yoga session. Yeah.
I think it's such a good point, and certainly one that people can really take a lot away from. Now, I want to be respectful of your time because I know that you have a super busy business. Let listeners know how they can connect with you. You have an amazing podcast. I swear I keep telling myself I'm going to join one of your book talks that you do within your group. I just keep trying to find the time to make for it. How can people connect with you on social media? How can they connect with you on your podcast, which I highly recommend?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So my wife and I do the Healthy Rebellion radio podcast. You can find all of that stuff at robbwolf.com. I have social media accounts, but I'm not on there. Like, I have a Substack now where I post some stuff on the Substack. I just find the interaction to be much higher quality, and the folks are invested in that. I basically just redirect all of my social accounts back to the Substack because I was ready to burn down all of social media, but this was kind of my compromise. But for now, that's it. Like, that's where folks can find me.
Wonderful. Well, obviously we'll have links to all your books and your podcast, and of course LMNT, which I highly recommend. And probably by the time this comes out, grapefruit will be sold out. But I would say my next favorite flavor is citrus. The orange salt is my favorite of all.
Yeah, me too. Orange is up there. Aside from grapefruit, is just a whole other like order of magnitude better that I absolutely love. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you again for coming on.
Hey, if you like this video, you guys are going to love this video, and I'll see you there.
We make almost all of our fat cells during childhood and puberty. And then once we finish puberty, we're done. That number of fat cells, in most people, there are some people who are an exception to this, and that's about 15% of people who are in the obese category. But most people reach a limit, and that's their fat cell number essentially for adulthood.